And welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression. Now, when we talked about the 1920s, we call it the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, and I described it as really the 1920s is like a big party. There were a lot of hardships during the 20s. There was a lot of difficulty, but overall, for the most part, the 1920s had a booming economy. People were buying into advertisements. It was a big increase in consumer spending and a big consumer culture. So if the 1920s is like a party, then the Great Depression is the hangover from that party. Now, economists are still in debate about what actually caused the Great Depression. The Great Depression is not something that is unique to the United States. All across the world, European countries were suffering from terrible depressions. And their depression started way before the United States. Now, some economists will say the depression actually began in the United States, but then the United States did things to cover it up. United States connection to the global market then caused terrible depressions overseas. And then it eventually came back to the United States. Other economists will say that its origins truly started in Europe. But what we do know is that during the 1930s, there is a major depression that takes place in the United States. Now, the president, when the depression was beginning, is not Calvin Coolidge, but it's a man named Herbert Hoover. Now, Calvin Coolidge, when he decides not to run for president again, and when he decides not to run in the election of 1928, he told his wife privately that a depression was coming, and he didn't want anything to do with that. And his choice not to run again really surprised the nation, and so it opened the way for a man named Herbert Hoover to win. Now, Herbert Hoover played a big role during World War I, the Great War, when he headed the Food Administration. He also served as a delegate at the Versailles Peace Conference. He idolized Woodrow Wilson, and you had people who really praised him. He was a big businessman. He was a Republican, progressive, conservative is what he talked about. And what Hoover really wanted to do is he wanted the government to encourage business leaders to do away with cutthroat competition, and he wanted voluntary cooperation. The election of 1928 was particularly really nasty. The reason it was really nasty is because his opponent, the Democratic candidate, is a man named Alfred E. Smith. He had previously served 4 terms as the governor of New York. He was a professional politician, but Smith's biggest problem is he was Roman Catholic, and he is the first Roman Catholic to ever run for president by a major party. So people started to say things like the Pope would end up running the country, and they were afraid of having some type of outside influence controlling the United States. You even have some Republicans try to argue that Smith was the Antichrist, and they just said really, really terrible, nasty, demeaning things towards Smith. So what ends up happening is in the election of 1928, Herbert Hoover wins in an absolute landslide. He wins 444 electoral votes, Smith only winning 87 electoral votes. Republicans also kept both control of both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it was the election was a clear indicator that people were still wanted to keep with the Republican Party. Now, to understand the causes of the Depression, most people, if you ask them what causes the Depression, they'll talk about the stock market crash. But it's important to understand the stock market crash is not exactly what causes the Depression. So what we're going to do now, we're going to look at how the stock market was connected to the economy in the 1920s, how the stock market operated, and the problems with that, and what that did to help create such a large depression. Now, Throughout the 1920s, really since about 1924 when the economy really started to pick up in the United States, the stock market could be classified as something called the Great Bull Market. Um, prices of shares were steadily rising, but it also was really kind of out of control. That's why you called it a bull market. Now, the problem though with this great bull market is how people bought stocks. So in the 1920s, it was extraordinarily easy for people to purchase stocks. And the reason for that is because people would buy stocks on what's called buying on the margin. Now, what this means is that an investor, a person, an American, could make a very small cash down payment called the margin on the share of the stock, and then they would borrow the rest of the price to buy the stock from a stockbroker. Now, what would happen is if the stock prices rose like they did pretty much through 1927 all the way through most of 1929, the investor who would make enough money, who bought the stock on the margin and took out a loan to pay for the rest, he would make enough money to pay off his margin loan. And then he would be able to reinvest the rest of his profit that he made. Now the problem is that if the stock price declined and the investor, the American who bought the stock, received a call from the person who gave him the loan, from his broker, he didn't have the money to pay back the person who gave him the loan. Now, what it's called when a person who loaned the money, so when the stockbroker loaned the investor money, if they come into a hardship, if the stock market, if the prices started to decline, what the stockbrokers would do is they would issue something called a margin call. Now, what this margin call is it was a call for people to pay back the loan that they'd been given, but the problem is that the Americans couldn't pay back that loan, and they couldn't pay back their loan because they had put all of the loan in the stock market. And with the decline in the market, that money is now gone. It's disappeared. Now, this was an extraordinarily reckless practice. It was very risky. And the problem is even though it was so risky, it was so reckless, by August of 1929, stockbrokers were lending investors, people who wanted to purchase stocks, more than 2/3 the face value of the stocks they were buying. So basically, to buy a stock by 1929, early in the summer of 1929, you just had to pay 1/3 of the price to purchase the stock, and the rest was bought on loan. And at first, very few people were concerned, and very few people saw a problem in this. Now, even though things seemed to kind of be going good, you had a lot of problems outside of the stock market. So by the late 20s, there started to be some signs elsewhere in the economy that there were some coming problems that were happening. Now, some of those problems were that people stopped, consumer spending was on decline. Most people had bought all of the goods, the things that they had been buying earlier. They had already purchased them, so you don't see people repeat buying things. And so there were some signs where manufacturing started to kind of slow down, industry was slowing down, but people didn't really pay much attention to it. Now, the big thing that happens, and the most important thing to think about when you think about the Great Depression, is that the Great Depression is not caused by the stock market alone. Now, what happens is on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, this is the day that the stock market took its first big nosedive. More than 12 million shares were traded at the same time, and it created unprecedented chaos. People absolutely lost their minds. And so Wall Street was in complete panic. Now, what was even worse about Black Thursday is that when the prices started to decline, they kept falling. And they kept falling all the way up until the point of a day called Black Tuesday. So the following Tuesday, things is when it really hit the bottom and the numbers really escalated. Now, what happens, and the reason the stock market is going to help kind of trigger the depression, is that this crash ignited a psychological panic. When the stock market crashed, Americans all across the country did what's called a run on the bank, meaning that by that Black Tuesday, people ran to their bank to try to take their money out of the bank. Now, the problem with this is that when Americans started to run on the bank and try to get all their money out, the banks didn't have their money to give to people. Now, the reason banks didn't have the money to give to people is the banks had overlent money. There was nothing in legislation, there were no laws, there were no restrictions that put limits on how many loans banks could extend. So basically, people would put their money in the bank, and on paper they would have X amount of dollars, but their X amount of dollars wasn't physically at the bank. The bank made money by then lending that money that people had entrusted in the bank to other people, and then they would charge interest, and then they would make money off of the interest. Now, what ends up happening is that because banks had overlent money, and when people started to run to the bank, millions of people were left bankrupt because banks just didn't have the money. And when word got out that banks no longer had money, the panic got even worse. And so what you see is that eventually banks are going to be forced to close their doors. Now, even individuals were not the only people who were affected by this. Firms and factories were also affected. Workers lost their jobs. Manufacturers virtually had to lay off their entire workforce. And the economy essentially shut down. So essentially what the Great Depression is it's not just the stock market crash, but it's the fact that there was no money in circulation. Now what that means is when people, if they were able to get cash out of the bank, so if they did have cash on hand, instead of spending that money, they hoarded it and they kept it. This is why a lot of people, like my great-grandmother, would often, even by the end of her life, in the 1990s and early 2000s, were scared of banks. They didn't want to put their money in the bank because they thought if they put the money in the bank, something like this could happen again. And it could make a whole nother depression. So people started hoarding on their money and they weren't spending it. Now, once people started hoarding onto their money and they no longer were spending any money they had, it virtually shut the economy down. Now, Hoover's administration then started to work to try to fix this problem, to try to get money back in circulation. The problem is some of the things that Hoover's administration does really work to make things worse. Now, one of the things that Hoover tries to do, and Hoover doesn't do this himself, but Congress does it, is there was a tariff that was passed called the HAWLEY-SMOOT tariff. Now, what the HAWLEY-SMOOT tariff did is it raised the protective tariff and crippled the international market. So basically what it does is it raised the international and the protective tariff, and by raising this tariff, it was trying to encourage people to buy American goods, and it was making goods produced in America more expensive. So what this does is it virtually shuts down trade, and it makes countries where the international market started to refuse to trade with the United States because it was so expensive to trade with the United States. Now, another thing they did is they raised the income tax to try to increase their revenue. But this did not work because it crushed American purchasing power even more. So what little money Americans were spending, this caused Americans to try to hold it in again. Now, this caused another steep drop in the stock market. You also have a problem, the Federal Reserve, which was established under Woodrow Wilson's administration. They started to work to try to fix it. Now, instead of expanding the nation's money supply, instead, the Federal Reserve actually reduced the nation's money. So they took money out of supply. So between 1929 and 1932, they took out virtually a third of the money in circulation to try to help encourage spending again. Now, what ends up happening is this leads to rampant unemployment. So by 1930, you have 4 million people unemployed. 1931, 8 million. By 1932, you have 12 million. And so this carefree kind of thinking of the 1920s, it is clearly over by the early 30s. In some cities, hungry people, they looted grocery stores. Nearly 1/4 of public school children suffered from malnutrition by 1932, which is really kind of seen as the height of the Great Depression. In 1931, a New York hospital reported that over actually 100 people, their cause of death was starvation because they were not getting enough food to eat. Homelessness was rampant. People lived in shanty towns, and they called these little shanty towns Hoovervilles. They literally were makeshift buildings built out of any leftover goods they could find. They would warm themselves up with what they called a Hoover blanket, which was basically an old scrappy newspaper. And still, Hoover did not want to use the federal government to try to boost the economy. He was afraid that if you increased the federal government's power, it would encourage Americans to turn towards socialism or some type of communist type of system. So he was a rugged believer in individualism and wanted people to pull themselves out of their bootstraps. Instead, Hoover wanted to try to fix the problems by working at a more local level, by getting states and local communities to help. He also wanted to work through charity organizations, but the problem is the extraordinarily wealthy, who usually would donate to these charity organizations, were not making their regular donations. And so it just continued to get worse. Now, by 1932, people were very critical of President Hoover, extraordinarily critical of him. But even though they were very critical of him, they still were trying to encourage him to do something. Now, one of the groups who really wanted to see something done were the veterans of the Great War, people who fought in World War I. And what they do is veterans who were no longer receiving payment and compensation for their service, they decided to march on Washington to try to demand that the Congress compensate them and pay them. Now, once Hoover saw and realized people were marching on Washington, he ordered people from the armed forces then to get rid of them. This whole event is called the Bonus Expeditionary Force March. It takes place in 1932. And he sends in the army. They evict all of the marchers, and they burn down their makeshift little Hoovervilles that they had built in Washington, D.C. Now, despite this, and despite all the negative press and the negative feelings about Herbert Hoover, the Republican Party still decided to run him in the election of 1932. Basically, the Republican Party, they did not know who else they could put up, and so they pretty much already admitted defeat. And the election in 1932 is one of the largest landslides in American history. As you can see, the Democratic candidate overwhelmingly wins. Now, the Democratic candidate who was nominated to run in 32 is a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR for short. And FDR wins in a landslide, and he really worked to try to reignite and try to encourage Americans to have faith, to trust, and to not be afraid of what's happening. And so FDR is really going to work on trying to build up the economy and build up people's, all across the United States, faith in the American government. Now, the thing about FDR is he did suffer from polio and was confined to a wheelchair. And in many ways, most people, it's really common to hear that he often tried to hide this, but most people did know that he was in a wheelchair, and people felt like they could associate with him because he had physical struggles. One of the way people also would try to associate themselves with FDR and try to really trust him is FDR started to go on the radio, and he started doing something called fireside chats, and it was basically a weekly kind of radio programming where he would invite people to personally write to the government and tell him his problems, and he would talk to the American people and try to encourage them of how to fix their problems. Many people wrote to his wife, Eleanor, asking for old clothes, asking for coats, and she would send them coats. FDR is related to a previous president, Teddy Roosevelt. They are cousins. And he is from an extraordinarily wealthy family, but because of his physical ailments, people thought, he understood what hardship could be like. And so what FDR is going to do once he's elected president is he is going to work to really build up American trust in the government and also try to rebuild the economy. He doesn't want to destroy capitalism. He wants to strengthen capitalism. Another really important thing about FDR, and we're going to talk about him a lot in the coming videos, is that many people call him an imperial president. He was elected 4 times, so he's going to be elected in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1945. He was an extraordinarily strong executive leader, and for many people, for a large span of their life, sometimes he's the president for their entire life. So he looms really huge in American life, and it allows him to build a really wide coalition of voters. You have Southerners who support him. You have African Americans who support him. You have progressives who support him. So he has a really diverse, really wide-ranging coalition of supporters, and we're going to talk about ways that he's able to use that to his advantage in the coming videos. But FDR is really going to work to try to jumpstart and fix the economy once he's elected in 1932.